Thank you for your paper. I'd like to read it. I don't, so you have to keep your promise. What's fascinating is a kind of switch, at least for my ears, because usually people think of sovereignty and sovereign equality as the discourse of the powerful, the West, the powerful, and something that was not accorded, obviously, to the peoples who were not capable of sovereignty. I'm talking 19th century. Both of the discussions combined seem to present the discourse of sovereignty and sovereign equality now as a discourse of the weak. So it's interesting. Actually, I suspect that it's both. And that at least ideologically, since 1940, well, whenever, 45, the UN Charter system, all of this, both the powerful and the weak invoke it for various purposes. Okay, so that's just sort of a comment. The other comment is that empire, as a world, I don't think that's uniquely Chinese. I mean, the concept, unless I'm wrong, again, you're the historian, not me, but I thought, in some sense, the concept of empire as distinct from imperialism, be it Roman or something else, is the idea that this is the world. I mean, there's stuff out there, but it's beyond the peripheries. You don't have real borders, but still. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a well, it'd be an interesting thought to think that that as China rises, which it is doing, that the discourse of sovereignty would be abandoned. I'd be surprised. I suspect that they just like everybody else would find other pretexts to justify whatever expansions are being engaged in, rather than abandoning it entirely. Since at least now there's not much chance of anybody thinking that their particular empire, and China is an empire still, and so is Russia. There won't even be more of one. That this would be abandoned entirely, since they know they're not alone in the world.
I answer the first question. You answer the second one. Okay. Okay. I agree that the sovereignty is for the weak. If you see the American independence, they talk about sovereignty, independence, respect for treaties, even included in the Constitution. If you see the French Revolution, you will find that they posed the principle of non-intervention, because there were too many the surrounding country, because it's a new republic, so it has to fight against the surrounding country, centralized country. So I think sovereignty, recently American government says that Ukrainian sovereignty should be respected. It's for the weak. So I really think that this is the right. The sovereignty is for the weak. Weak always talk about sovereignty. Because right now, I totally agree that just now you said that China thinks that it is a little bit isolation in international society, in ideology. So it talks about sovereignty. That's right now. But 60 years ago, when China talked about the sovereignty, it was in a weak position. It has to defend itself, its territorial, everything.
Yes, so going to the issue of empires and imperialism, I suspect that you belong to those who use empire as a pejorative word, while I belong to those who use it as a positive word, actually. I know that my American colleagues always say me that when I'm writing about empires, I must know that they create a negative impact among some of the readers because imperialism is a bad word. I think that speaking historically, if you speak that China is an empire because it integrates huge, diverse populations, and I don't speak now about national minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang, those whom we call Chinese are more diverse than dwellers of Europe. Surely the southwestern Chinese coast and southeastern Chinese coast and northwestern China are more divergent than Poland and Portugal. But I think that is it negative to have these large integrative states? Is the idea of dividing the people into small units is so?
I was thinking more of anyway. The first one was that China as an obviously there are other empires with this conception, so that's a neutral term. The second point was there's another alternative, but I don't want to get into it. I'm not saying you have to undo China, but the other alternative would be federation. But I don't. It's not my.
It was entertained in China for a very, very short while in the early 20s, and the result was that it was used by the warlords to divide China just like they did it in Afghanistan or in Lebanon during the Civil War. So it did not work in Chinese context, at least. The attempt was a failure. The idea is actually that historically, I think that we can summarize Chinese history of 2,000 years. It is constant attempt to create more integral state, and whenever there is a crisis, of course, everything is divided again, and then there is a saying that in China that the great forces of all under heaven, after a prolonged division, they unify, and after prolonged unity, they divide again. So it's a kind of
Mine is a very short question. There was a period when I was young and beautiful when everybody spoke about about the Asian values, and contrasted them with Western values, individualism versus collectivism, and blah blah blah. And I wonder whether this now this has died out. I don't know, very quickly, and I wonder whether this ideological vacuum that you refer to doesn't give rise to the same type of I mean, is it a dead concept? Do the Chinese find it inappropriate to use or ineffective? And why has this, I mean, given the fact that there is an ideological vacuum, I would expect that this notion that was very much spoken about in the, I think the 90s, I think, am I right, 90s? Would come into existence again. So this is just an informative question, I guess.
Married, right?
Yeah, no, I remember the word.
okay. Yes. Okay.
Well, I mean, it comes back to that question about empires, and you know, so many things can be understood of states are empires insofar as they exercise imperium. But of course, European historians use the word habitually in a pejorative sense because they're often dealing with extremely destructive empires, such as thinking the Spanish conquests of the Americas, for example, or the extermination of indigenous people in North America or in Australia, for that matter. So there's a good reason, obviously, for that sense, but we do tend to forget the other senses of empire. My question was more about what motivates those empires. For the European empires, and the universal impulse motivating those European empires I don't think it was missionary. I think it was more about what Daniel was talking about this morning, which was a certain understanding of property, its relation to concepts of just war and the law of nations, its ability to be exported around the globe. And I think that's the thing that really drove those destructive modern European empires. And my question is, and I don't know if it is a question or a comment, that as China perhaps is moving towards a similar way of thinking about property, it may be going to think about its relations to other sovereigns or people outside of its imperium in ways perhaps that Europeans have done.
Okay, I shall answer the first, and you shall answer the second. Then it will be.
Historian, yeah, please.
So I shall be the first. Okay. Asian values was an invention of very powerful Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who financed a few great scholars in Harvard, etc., like Li Ming, and then they tried to create a nice word for Chinese Confucian values, but in Singapore you cannot speak about Chinese because there are Indian and Muslim minorities, etc. And then you need to find some kind of Asian, non-European values, which was a failed attempt, a very briefly abandoned attempt to create an alternative to hegemonic Western discourse. Now, there are people who are working on this continuously, usually under the title of Confucianism. There are my good colleagues in Westerns in Chinese universities and Chinese in Western universities who try to create it. It's a very interesting idea because Chinese Confucian, or let us call it here Confucian, I would not allow my students to use this term, but for this conference, the Confucian discourse, it was a hegemonic discourse. Everybody believed. It was shared by everybody. Even the conquerors of China adapted to the idea that all under heaven should be ruled by one emperor, and that the literati should rule all under heaven, and that the people, the commoners, deserve at most concern economically, but not political rights, etc. It was shared by everybody. And then it was shattered by the Western imperialist powers in the 19th century, and by the 20th century disappeared. And now we have a hegemonic discourse of democracy and human rights, which is also shared by everybody. Even people don't question it. It is a kind of axiomatic ideas. Some ideas, human beings are equal. Is it axiomatic? Actually, we accept it as an axiom. We dare not, after the very bad experiences of the last century plus, to question it. But in China, for instance, the axiom was that human beings are not equal. There are superior men who have superior intellectual abilities, and commoners who have absolute economic rights, but they don't have moral and intellectual abilities that allow them to participate in the rule. Now, China lost it completely. It is impossible to resurrect these Asian values. You cannot gather the water which was poured out. You can create something completely new. Whether or not it will be created, I dare not to predict now. I cannot see now even the seeds of new, powerful, hegemonic values created in China. The ideological field is completely dominated until now by the West, and I think that this hegemony will remain for at least one generation to few generations. It's not something which is going to be shattered, and that you cannot invest in a university and create values which will be shared by everybody. It's not like it's not like building an infrastructure. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but I don't believe that today. And I think that Professor Li will answer your question. And if
Sorry.
about the empires and nation.
As I say, it's a comment as much as a question.
Yeah.
Whether the turn to a different conception of property would change the notion of empire.
Property. So in Ming Dynasty, the economy in China was very developed, and some historians did research in this period, and maybe the answer is that China closed the door and interrupted the communication between China and the other parts of the world. And finally, the Western country used power to open the door of China. At that time, China was undeveloped and was in a position of inequality. So that's the modern Chinese history. Yeah. I think it's a very interesting issue, and many historians is researching this aspect. I think the most important reason is that two parts, China and the other world, had no connections. That's the reason.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I dare not add in much because I think that I never thought about it from the angle of property. I'm sorry, I work a lot about empires. It's my field, comparative imperiology and imperial cultures, but I never thought about this aspect, and you challenged me. I shall have to think about it more because I simply don't know how.
Well, I think we should have economics as part of the discussion. We've been talking about morality and law a lot, but economics, I think, is a very important part of this.
Economically, let me say, traditional China was not expansionist because of economics, because of in a pre-modern economic situation, all the agricultural lands of East Asia were under Chinese control, except for small areas in Korea and Vietnam, which were beyond the conquest. So there was no impetus to conquer anything, because economically any conquest, including the conquest of areas which are now part of China, Tibet and Xinjiang, was economically disastrous. It was done for strategic reasons in the 18th century, but economically it was costly, and that is why perhaps it is maybe one of the reasons for which Western imperial powers and China differ. For Westerns, expansion was beneficent economically. For China, traditional China at least, expansion was an economic disaster, and it was very clearly set in the court debates already in the 2nd century BC. Whenever we expand, we lose money. We gain bare lands, and we lose our toilers who can pay taxes. So why should we expand? It's a very challenging question, which I don't know how to answer, how it fits to the modern economics. I simply dare not to answer.
So I think it's a very good note with which to end this fascinating session. Thank you very, very much.